On February 8, 1904, the Empire of Japan declared war upon Russia. After 210,000 casualties, and a year and a half later, on September 5, 1905, it was over, and the world would never be the same. In the year 1900, the golden age of Europe was in full swing. The Empire of Great Britain alone covered one-third of the entire world's landmass and governed 450 million people. The entirety of the Western world had a mission to civilize. From Jamaica to Indonesia, the European presence was overwhelming. Hand in hand with the power the Europeans had received came the belief that they were in fact superior to all other races or cultures. For the past 400 years, the European armies had almost universally triumphed over, in their opinions, uncivilized cultures. Some of the fiercest armies from China, India, and South Africa were no match for the weapons of the West. The Europeans appeared to be invincible. Yet in the 1800s, a new world power began to emerge from the East, the Japanese Empire. Armed with Western technology and training recently acquired from Western nations, Japan looked to the weak and unstable Chinese subcontinent for colonial gains to prove its newfound might. And in 1894, looking to control Korea, Japan declared war upon the nation of China. In a little over a year, the Chinese army and navy were crushed in a series of Japanese-dominated battles. And in 1895, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki, ceding Formosa and diplomatic control of Korea. While Japan continued to track towards modernization, the Empire of Russia began to move in on Far East Asia. Looking to expand its sphere of influence towards Korea, Russia used the Chinese Boxer Rebellion of 1900 as a pretext to send troops to occupy Manchuria, just above the Korean peninsula. Effectively occupying the area to promote Russian interests, Russia expanded its diplomatic influence on Korea and China, and eventually obtained a lease for the Liaodong Peninsula on which Port Arthur lay. This course of action brought up fierce hostility between Russia and Japan, as both sides had a vested interest in the area. For the next 3 years, both sides tried to reach a compromise, but after no headway was gained, Japan delivered an ultimatum to the Russian government. If Russia did not withdraw its troops from Manchuria and recognize Japanese authority in Korea, war would be declared. Russia, determined to keep its only warm water port and sure of a quick Russian victory, refused the demands. On February 10, 1904, the war had begun. Although Russian spirits were high, it soon became apparent that its armies and navies were not prepared for war. Russian troops and sailors were undertrained and misled, and although Russia had a massive army ready to do battle, Russia's Trans-Siberian Railway, intended on being used for transporting supplies and reinforcements to the east, was understaffed and incomplete, making transport difficult. Meanwhile, Russia's navy was obsolete and was primarily based in Europe, and it would not be able to reach Asia for months. But despite these overwhelming obstacles Russia faced, it was confident that they could beat an upstart nation like Japan. For months before the declaration of war, Japan had been preparing its navy and army for battle. Organizing plans and mustering troops, Japan was ready and willing to go to war. Although only having 1/6 the manpower of Russia, Japan's forces were better trained and had an easier supply route, with a navy to back it up. These factors would soon give Japan a definitive edge in the war. With their modern army as their spear point of their offensive, on February 8th, 2 days before the declaration, Japan landed troops in central Korea and began advancing up the peninsula. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet attacked and crippled the Russian armada in Chemulpo and Port Arthur. Before the war had officially begun, Japan wreaked havoc on Russia's Far East fleet. With Japan's naval superiority sealed, the Japanese army in Korea began its advance north towards Port Arthur, when in April 1904, Russian and Japanese land forces in northern Korea began to engage in a broad front of warfare. Disorganized, Russian land forces began to withdraw north to regroup for supplies and reinforcements, but was smashed at the Battle of Yalu during a Japanese surprise attack. Losing 3,000 men in comparison to Japan's 1,000, the Russians were forced to retreat. For the Japanese, this made a success that was unexpected. Spectators are still in doubt whether to marvel most at Russian carelessness or at the marching power of the Japanese infantry. Frederick Palmer, English Observer. Unrelenting, Japan's forces pursued the Russians back to Port Arthur, inflicting heavy casualties along the way. With Russia's army in full rout, Japan staged landings along the Liaodong Peninsula, and by May 10th, Port Arthur was cut off. Hoping to capture the port early, many attacks were launched in Port Arthur, and Japanese losses were stiff. Yet the attacks and their brutality never dwindled. There was a fight with bombs at the enemy's skirmish trenches. The bombs sent up from our side exploded finally, and the place became at once a conflagration. Boards were flung about, sandbags burst, heads flew around, legs were torn off. The flames mingled with the smoke, lighted up our faces weirdly with a red glare, and all at once the battle lines became confused. Lieutenant Tadashi Sakurai, Japanese officer. Meanwhile, the Japanese forces launched many attacks into Manchuria and established a front in an attempt to further isolate Port Arthur from its allies, culminating in the Battle of Liaoyang in late September. After a cumulative 40,000 casualties from both sides, the Russians withdrew further into Manchuria to escape the onslaught. With Russia's land forces failing them, they once again turned to their navy, ordering the undersupplied and outdated Baltic fleet to make for the east. With few friendly ports to resupply on the route to Korea, it would take the Russians months to reach their allies. As the year drew to a close, the gridlock on the fronts continued. Japan's relentless assaults on Port Arthur, while gaining ground, cost an enormous amount of life on both sides. Finally, on January 2, 1905, with all the garrison's fleet scuttled, Port Arthur surrendered. With this final blow, the Russian morale was crushed. Meanwhile, the Russian Baltic fleet had finally arrived in May 1905. With little to nothing to accomplish after the fall of Port Arthur, they were to dock at Vladivostok harbor in Russian territory. But soon after setting out, they were intercepted by the Japanese main fleet. The largest naval battle of the Russo-Japanese War had commenced. In one day, Russia's Baltic fleet was smashed, hunted down, and almost universally destroyed. With over 10,000 casualties and their navy fully defeated, Russia was convinced that they were beat. Within 3 months of Russia's catastrophic defeat, a peace treaty was finally signed on September 5, 1905, at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The war was over. In the treaty, Russia was forced to hand over Port Arthur and the surrounding peninsula. In addition, Russia was made to leave Manchuria and withdraw their diplomatic connections from Korea. Labeled as the Treaty of Portsmouth, it was the first instance where a Western power gave concessions to an Eastern one. The Russo-Japanese War, while short, changed the course of history as we know it. Labeled the First Modern War, it heralded two key new changes for the next century. For one, it had shaken the great powers of the West. An uncivilized Eastern nation had not only beaten a larger Western country on the field of battle, it had crushed it. Never again could the great Western countries of Great Britain and France say that without a doubt their armies were invincible to the uncivilized. With confidence of the Europeans shaking, the growing number of dissidents in their colonies would soon rise, and the Europeans would have to give up their dreams of colonial conquest forever. I hate imperialism. I detest colonialism. And I fear the consequences of their last bitter struggle for life. We are determined that our nation and the world as a whole shall not be the plaything of one small corner of the world. Sukarno, first Indonesian president. Within 40 short years and 2 brutal wars, almost the entirety of Europe's old colonies would be set free. While not impacting most of these liberations directly, this war completely changed the Europeans' view of the Eastern nations and cultures. Secondly, this war would signal the rise of the Japanese Empire. Within the same 40 years of the decline of the West, Japan would soon annex Korea, Manchuria, Southeast Asia, and throw the world's peace into peril again. Without Japanese victory and the rise of the empire, it is uncertain if the balance of European power in the Pacific would have been changed at all. In fact, the principal reason for the release of most of the Asian colonies after World War II was the direct impact of Japanese occupation. This war would forever shift the balance of the power in Asia, both then and now. Japan would become the premier power in the East. When all was said and done, the Russo-Japanese War was a key turning point in history. It marked the beginning of the end of the Western empires and the rise of the East.